Well, now that we know how we got the Bible, we are about to, in this class, transition into basically for the rest of the semester, you all are going to be reading the biblical text. And so as you read the Bible, it's important to understand that none of us just read. As we read the Bible, we're trying to put all the pieces together and make sense of what we read. And that process of putting all the pieces together and making sense of what we read is called interpretation, biblical interpretation. And so as you get ready to read the Bible, I thought it would be very helpful for you if I gave you a brief overview. You might notice the PowerPoint here, a brief overview. This is exceedingly brief overview of how to interpret the Bible. So my goal is just to give you some tools so that you can make sense of what you're reading and try to put it together. I just want to emphasize that this is exceedingly brief. We actually offer in our department an entire class on this very topic. It's called Biblical Interpretation. It's BTS 283. I encourage you, if you have any aspirations of ever teaching in any fashion whatsoever the Bible, that you take our BTS 283 class as an elective. It is really important that if you're going to teach, God's Word in James says that God holds teachers to a higher standard, that you know what you're doing and you know how to put the pieces together. So, but all that aside, what we're going to do today is just, I'm going to walk you through really briefly how to interpret the Bible. Now to get us started, I want you guys to do a little exercise for me. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to just divide up at your tables, and you're going to share three things with each other at your tables. So the first thing I want you to do is I want you to, first question I want you to answer is, what is your favorite movie? Okay? What is your favorite movie? The second one is what is the message of that movie? In other words, if you had to summarize kind of what the screenwriter and the producer wanted you to take away from that movie in one sentence, what would you say? Or even one phrase. What's the message of that movie? And then the last question is really important, but one that with movies we don't even think about. And that is, how do you know that that is the message of the movie? In other words, if somebody else in here said, I don't think that's the main point of that movie, how would you make the argument that that is the main point of the movie? Okay? So what is your favorite movie? What's the main point, main message of the movie, major theme? And then the third thing is, how do you know that that is the main message or main point of your movie? All right, discuss it, and then we'll come back in just a few minutes and talk about it. I wanted you to do that exercise is because when we think of, we don't think much of reading in our culture, unfortunately. We think in categories of movies. And we have seen so many movies that most of us intuitively know how to, quote unquote, put the pieces together and, quote unquote, interpret the movie. And so as we think about movies, here's the interesting thing, that with movies, many of the same tools or the same things that we would highlight as we talk about what the meaning of a movie is also apply to the biblical text. Because when we're watching a movie and we talk about the main theme of that movie, what we're doing is we're basically saying that main theme is what the movie is pointing to, and we can argue by repetition, by the plot line. We're trying to make sense of the plot, how the characters work, and all that together. And so I wanted you to do that because I'm going to come back to more and more movies as we go through talking about how to interpret the Bible, to kind of help you draw a bridge from our contemporary context where we're very movie-driven to an ancient context where it's more text-driven on understanding a story. Okay? Now, before we jump into really the nuts and bolts of how to interpret the Bible, I want to first of all begin by talking about the goal of interpretation, the ultimate goal of interpretation. Now, so the question is, what is the goal of interpretation? Let me just say this on the outset. This is a vague question that I don't expect you to get because you don't know where I'm going with this. But because there are many goals to interpreting the Bible, right? I mean, we could talk about one goal could be to know God and love God better, which I would argue is the purpose of our very existence, right? But what I'm asking on this question is not so much kind of the relational aspect, which is an important goal, but I want to talk about it in terms of worldview a little more. And so let me set it up this way. So in our culture, as we talked about a few weeks ago, the most pervasive worldview, especially when it comes to interpreting literature, is postmodernism. And if you remember, postmodernism says there's no truth with a capital T. It's just a bunch of truths with lowercase t's. And the way this looks when it comes to interpreting a book or interpreting even the Bible is that basically the meaning of a book or the meaning of a passage is really determined by the reader, right? So with postmodernism, there's a high skepticism towards the author, because in postmodernism, they view the author as someone who has an agenda. And oftentimes the author, according to postmodernism, is not even aware of his agenda because he's been so influenced by the culture around him. And so as readers, our goal is kind of to deconstruct, to kind of critique the author and what his agenda is, and then read it from a reader-centered perspective. So in that regard, when we talk about the goal of interpretation, as Christians, we, from a worldview perspective, we see God as the author of all things. He's the creator of the universe. We also see him, as we talked about last week, we also see God as the one who inspired the biblical authors to write Scripture. So when we read the Bible, what are we after? Well, what we should be after is we want to know what God is communicating through the Scripture, through the human author, right? So ultimately, because we can't separate God and the human author, because you remember, God spoke through the human author, the ultimate goal of interpretation is the author's intent. And by author's intent, what we mean is we want to know what the author intended to communicate in his book. So we want to know, in other words, when Paul wrote Ephesians, what was he intending to communicate? Not what we want him to communicate, not what we think he should communicate, but we want to know what the biblical author communicated. That is called authorial intent. So if that's our goal, how do we get there? Well, let's talk about the movies. If two of you have a disagreement on a movie as far as what the main message of that movie is, the main point, in other words, why this scene here, why did that character say that, there's possibility you can actually find out the answer. And that possibility would be through if you basically found an interview on YouTube with the producer or even an actor in the movie or somebody who's discussing the movie and the themes and what the movie was meant to communicate. That's one way. Another way is oftentimes, today on DVD and Blu-ray disc, you get the bonus features. And oftentimes in the bonus features, you have like a producer's interview in which he or she discusses the movie. And so today, if you are talking about communication, like if you have a text message from a friend and you're kind of confused over what he or she meant, then all you have to do is go ask her, what did you mean in this text message? And she will tell you her intent, what she intended to communicate. Now, there's a problem, though, because with the Bible, we can't go talk to the authors. Why? Because they are dead. And so because we don't have access to the authors, the only way that we can understand the author's intent is by reading the text that they left us. So how in the world do we understand the author's intents through the text? Well, this is important. And this is where understanding the Bible as a human book comes in. Because the biblical authors used the conventions and the writing styles of the literature of their day in order to communicate their message. So the better we understand the literary conventions of their day, the better we are to understand how they conveyed their message and get at what they intended to communicate. So in other words, we analyze what they wrote using what we might say is common methods of interpreting literature that would help us better understand the meaning of the text. So let's talk about how we do that. So here we go. Let's talk about the process of interpretation. The process of interpretation. Number one, here's the first thing we should do. This is going to be riveting for you, but it's pretty simple. Read and reread. In other words, to understand a book, you have to read it, and here's the key, and reread it. Right? The Bible was not written for us just to read it one time. Okay? So let me give you a few tips about what we might call engaged reading. In other words, reading it and rereading it so that we get at what the author intended, the meaning of text. The first thing what we understand is that engaged reading makes good observations and asks good questions. When you read the Bible, you should be like a detective. Why did this happen? What's going on here? How does this work? Right? We should be constantly asking questions, because you know what questions do? They cause us to dig deeper. And questions cause us to ask other questions and to make observations and to compare and to contrast. And as we ask questions, we will understand the biblical text at a much deeper level. Another important thing, though, is to understand what we're going to talk about a lot in this class, and that is the overarching story of the Bible. In other words, as we are reading it, we need to understand that it's one story, and so we have to keep in mind the whole story as we read the individual parts. And so as you are taking this class, that's the purpose of this class, is to help you get the big picture, so that no matter where you're reading in the biblical text, you always are keeping the big story in mind as you read the little stories. And then the other thing is this is really important. Oftentimes, the way that we read Scripture hinders us from understanding it. In other words, it's very common among Christians to read a chapter a day. You know what they say? A chapter a day keeps the devil away. But let me put that. Let's take that model, a chapter a day, and throw it into the movie illustration. So let me just do this. Let's say that you have your favorite movie that you just talked about, and tonight you go to your dorm room and you play the first scene, and then you pause it. Okay. Then you go about your business tomorrow, and tomorrow night you go back and you watch the second scene, and then you pause it. And then so forth and so on. You watch the whole movie that way. You watch one scene, you pause it for 24 hours, come back, watch another scene. What have you just done to your movie? You have ruined your movie. Like, in other words, you have taken the greatest movie ever and you've made it an absolute pain to watch. Why? Because of how you watched it. If you watch that movie straight through, beginning to the end, you get the beginning, you get the climax, you get all the parts of the movie in one sitting. But think about it. The reason many people get bored by reading the Bible is because they read one chapter a day. And they take so long of breaks between chapters, you've ruined the story. So I would encourage you, especially if you're reading like Old Testament stories, like narratives, we'll talk about that in just a second, or even like the Gospels and Acts and stuff like that, to make sure that you're reading the whole big chunks and get in the story. One chapter doesn't hardly get you into the story before you're pausing and going for a long time before you come back. So how we read is important, and so I would encourage you to read big chunks of Scripture so that you get the full story on that. So imagine, again, if you were reading like if you've ever read a novel, like a good story, what happens to people? They get hooked in the story and they're like, man, I couldn't put that down. I stayed up to 3 o'clock last night reading. Happens to my wife all the time. My wife's a prolific reader. And she'll start reading a book and she'll be like, oh man, I stayed up too late because I couldn't put the book down. And think about it. Think about reading a novel. If you take one little chapter out of the novel, you're not going to understand what's going on in the beginning and the end. And that's oftentimes how we read the Bible. So we want to be engaged readers. We want to read and reread. And we want to make sure that we're not just barely reading. We want to get deep into the story as we're reading it. All right, that's the first step. The second step in interpreting the Bible is really important, and this is identify the genre. Okay? Now, the genre simply refers to the type of literature that it is, okay? And it's really important that we identify it because each genre has its own set of kind of rules. So let me give you an illustration. One of the best, coolest things about being a dad is at Christmas and birthdays when your kids like get something like a new toy or something even more complex and complicated, like a new playground set, and you get to put it together, right? And usually whenever you have a new product that requires assembly, when you pull out the manual, at the very beginning, there is the directions for how to put it together. At the very beginning, there's a little section that most men just completely ignore, and that's called the tools required section. And so what that section does, it tells you the tools you're going to need to complete your project successfully, okay? Now, if you skip that section, you might be able to complete it just based on knowledge, but if you skip that section and you don't have any knowledge of tools, you're probably not going to have much success being together your product. Okay? Now, when we think about genre, whenever we identify the genre of the book, what we are doing is we then know which toolbox or which tools from our interpretive tool belt that we need to use in order to interpret that passage. Okay? So we don't interpret like what we might call Jesus' parables. So think about Jesus' parables. When Jesus told a parable, he was speaking in metaphorical terms. So one of the most popular ones is the parable of the sowers. Jesus tells a parable of a guy who's sowing seed and the 4 types of soil that it lands on. Well, Jesus never intended for us to interpret that literally. In other words, the message of that parable isn't go outside and plant seed on 4 types of soil. I mean, we would have really good, we could do some good planting on rocky soil in the Ozarks, but that's not the point of the story. The point of that story is Jesus later tells us is that the 4 soils actually represent 4 types of people and how they receive the message of God's kingdom. Okay? And so that's important to see that parables, when the tools we bring into parables are, okay, this is not literal, I should interpret this figuratively, and I have to figure out what the main point is. Okay? On the other hand, if we go read the Gospels, the whole Gospel, so parables are in the Gospel. So if we're reading a story about Jesus, like where he healed someone or he was teaching. When you read those stories, those are called narrative, and those we do interpret in a literal manner. We interpret those as historical events that actually happened, and then we ask the question, what's Jesus doing and why is he doing it and stuff like that. So you see, a narrative, which is a story, a historical story, and a parable require 2 sets of interpretive tools. So understanding the genre is key to being able to properly interpret. So let me briefly, this is just a representative list. This isn't all the genres, but let me briefly give you a list of some of the key genres in the biblical text that you're going to know. So the first genre in the biblical text that you need to be aware of is called narrative. And narrative is a monster genre, especially for the Old Testament. Okay? In particular, pretty much Genesis all the way through Esther. Sorry, I had the same book. Genesis all the way through Esther in the Old Testament is nothing but a narrative. Almost all those books. There's some poetry, some poems mixed in. Occasionally, there's some in earlier books. There's some law code mixed in. But overall, that's mostly narrative. So you can see a large chunk of the Old Testament is narrative. And like I just mentioned, when you go over the New Testament, the Gospels and the book of Acts would also be considered narrative. It's story. It's telling a story. And out of all the genres, narrative corresponds the most closely to what we would consider like our modern movies. In other words, the tools you would use to interpret or to explain a movie would also be the ones that apply to a narrative. Now, the other monster genre in the Old Testament would be poetry. So when you think about poetry, you think about the book of Psalms, you think about the book of Proverbs, you think about the prophets. The prophets have a lot of poetry. And in the Old Testament, in Hebrew poetry, it's dominated by what's called parallelism. And that is where you have kind of 2 lines, and those 2 lines have some strong parallels. Either there's similarity, like they both kind of repeat the same thing in different words. Sometimes they'll contrast one another. There's a variety of ways that those 2 lines or sometimes 3 lines will interact, but that's the dominant feature of poetry, a lot of poetry in the Old Testament. And then the third is the most common one probably in the New Testament as far as number of books, and that is the epistles. And the epistles are simply letters that were written to various churches and individuals. And when we get to each of these, we'll talk more specifically about how to interpret them. But the epistles are very common in the New Testament. I've already mentioned the parables. The parables are just good to know because that was one of Jesus' favorite teaching methods, was to speak in parables so that people might understand the kingdom of God. And then the last one, which is very unique. In fact, this last one, we really don't have a genre in our modern world that really corresponds significantly to this one. But this last one is called apocalyptic. And apocalyptic literature is dominated by symbolism. It's always a vision. So this messenger, God will send like an angel to somebody, and that person will see a vision, And the vision will be just crazy things that we don't know what they mean. They meant something to the ancient world, and they were symbolic. And so you'll see dragons and beasts and giant women and all kinds of crazy stuff. This is the book of Revelation, part of the book of Daniel. So we'll talk, in particular when we get to Revelation, we'll talk a little bit about apocalyptic literature. But again, it is a common literary genre in the Bible as well. Okay? So that's the genre. So first thing we do, we want to read and reread the passage. Then we want to make sure we know what genre we're in, identify the genre. And then the third part is we want to also identify the structure of the passage. The structure of the passage. So identifying the structure of the passage is important because more than anything, identifying the structure helps us to make sense of the pieces in light of the whole. Okay? So it's kind of like if you were building a house and you got your house plans with the architect. The architect would draw out all your house plans, and you could see all the individual parts of your house. It's the same way with a biblical book. The biblical books are oftentimes built, and so like we're looking at a house, we want to see how everything kind of fits together and how it flows together. And the authors do that by using structure and different structural devices. Okay? Now, let me just give you a few examples. That we can think about structure on the level of a passage. So, in other words, your first reading in this class is going to be Genesis 1. And as you read Genesis 1, what you're going to notice is that the structure of Genesis 1, it is structured after 7 days. So each day begins with, and God, well, the first 6 days all begin with, and God said, and then it is followed by the day ends with, and there was evening and there were morning, the blank day. Okay? So that's the structure. So that gives us a neat structure for Genesis 1 that we can really tune into and see. And so how does that help us interpret? Well, when we read Genesis 1, you'll notice that the days are all various lengths, but there's one day that gets a lot more attention than the others. And so that should draw our attention to that day as more significant. There's something going on there, right, on the structure. So that's one way. So by key phrases at the beginning and the end in this pattern of structure. There's also structure at the level of a book. So for instance, when we get to the New Testament, we're going to see the book of Acts. And the book of Acts has a few structural issues, features. But one is in Acts 1:8, there's a key verse where basically it said, Jesus tells his disciples that they would be witnesses in Jerusalem and in Judea and in all Samaria and to the ends of the earth. And those geographical locations become basically the guide for understanding the book. They become the guide for the three major sections of the book. So we have witnesses in Jerusalem, and then we have in Judea, and then Jerusalem, and then we have witnesses in Judea and Samaria, and then the last section of the book is witnesses to the ends of the earth. And so that's how the structure helps us understand the book as a whole. So when you're reading, what you want to do is you want to try to make sense of where there's a break and a new section begins and a section ends. And there's numerous ways this can happen. If you're reading a story, you oftentimes, kind of like a movie, you'll notice a scene change when a new character comes in, or when a location change, the camera moves to a different location. The time changes or something like that. You also can get, like in Genesis, you'll get headings. In Genesis, the structure of Genesis is based on the headings. These are the genealogies of, these are the generations of, depending on your translation. And then oftentimes you get kind of major breaks and pivots, and then you also can find transition words and phrases. So when a new scene comes, it might say like, and it came to pass, right? That would be a transition to a new component of the story. So you want to pay attention to those things and then always keep the big picture in mind and understand how all the individual passages fit into the larger book, and it helps you make sense of everything. Okay? So we read, we identify genre, we identify structure. And before I tell you the next step, I want to do a little exercise. So in your head or out loud, I want you to explain what chair means. Okay, so we think of chair as something that you're sitting in right now, right? Something that has at least three, maybe most of the time four, but at least three legs that you can, that has a surface that you can sit in, right? But chair also can refer to, like in academic settings, it would refer like to the head person over a department. A committee has a chair, which is the person who leads the committee. So it can be two things. So with this slide up here, though, we're not able to decide which meaning it has. Okay? Now, let's go one more time. In the chair. Now we might be able to explain a little better. We've narrowed it down, and it seems by adding putting it in a prepositional phrase that we're probably still talking about that we're now talking about for sure a chair that someone sits in. Okay? But the question still remains, who is in the chair? Where's the chair? What's going on? So then we add another one. He sat in the chair. So now we know that there is a male who has actually put his rear end in a chair. That's what we know. He sat in the chair, tells us that there is a male. And then we have another question, right? And that is, the question might be, who is he? And so then we can add another sentence, and it says, John went to class, he sat in the chair. You see how this works? In order to understand a word, you need a phrase. In order to understand a phrase, you need a sentence. In order to understand a sentence, you need a paragraph. In order to understand a paragraph, you need a full text. Okay? And this is crucial. So here's the principle. Pay attention to the context. If you do not hear anything else I say ever in this class or in this lecture, just hear this. When you interpret the Bible, the most important thing is to pay attention to the context. Here's how this works. One of the things that happens in our churches is that people we are super focused on getting application out of the Bible. In other words, we want to see how the Bible applies to our lives. And that is a good thing. God didn't mean for us just to leave the Bible in our heads and not do anything. He wants us to apply it. But what oftentimes happens, though, is in order to get a quick and easy application, we pull verses out of context. And we pull verses out of context and then use them in a way that is inconsistent with their context. We're actually lying to ourselves. That's actually what Satan did when he tempted Jesus. He pulled a passage out of context. So let me give you an example of one well-known one. That is Philippians 4:13. So here's the question for us. Can you tell someone what the context of Philippians 4:13 is? You see, athletes and others, it's not just athletes, but athletes primarily, love to slap Philippians 4:13 on their eye paint, on their wristbands, on their neck, wherever. And they go by Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. But most people cannot tell you the context of Philippians 4:13. You see, Philippians 4:13, if you read the context gives a qualifier to that phrase, all things. Okay, in the context of Philippians 4:13, Paul is talking about how the ministry God has given him, God has enabled him, I can do all things through Christ, he enabled him to fulfill his ministry in both the great times and in the really hard times. In other words, he's talking about God's empowering him to do the ministry God has called him to do regardless of the circumstances. And he's learning to be content in whatever his circumstances are. Now, that verse does not mean that you can do anything you want to do because Christ is going to strengthen you. Okay, this is the important part. What we do is we take that verse and we baptize it in Disney Channel theology, and then we say, I can be or do anything I want to do, and Christ is going to strengthen me. And that's simply not the case. Listen. As much as I would love to play in the NBA, I will never, ever be able, no matter how hard I work, no matter how much I want to, be able to play in the NBA. You know why? Because God created me as a 5'11", uncoordinated man, just to be honest with you. And I will not ever play in the NBA. And that is not, there's nothing wrong with that, okay? Because God has called me to something. So if God has called you to something, Philippians 4:13 gets closer to the heart of what the passage means. But it doesn't mean I can be or do anything I want to do like we oftentimes use it. So this is really important. So let me give you a good rule of it, a good piece of advice when it comes to quoting verses. When you quote a verse, if you cannot describe or tell someone the context of the verse, you should not quote it. So in other words, don't quote Philippians 4:13 unless you can do what I just did and explain the context of that verse. Same thing with Jeremiah 29:11, 2 Chronicles 7:14. Any of those passages, if you cannot tell the context, don't quote it. Why? Because it will protect you from using the verse in a way that is inconsistent with its context. You must pay attention to context. It's the same way when we try to read one chapter out of a big novel without understanding the whole story, it always is confusing. Okay? Now, the last thing on the process is, so we read, we identify the genre, we identify the structure, we pay attention to the context, and then the last thing is we want to identify themes and the major theme. Themes and the major theme. So in other words, this is what I was asking you at the beginning of class when I asked you to identify the main message of the movie. What I was asking you to do is identify the theme. So let me give you a definition of what a theme is. So this is from a guy named David Klein. He says, a theme is that which best explains the content, the structure, and the development of the book. It best explains the content, structure, and development of the book. So content, in other words, what's in the book. So whatever our theme is it needs to be able to make sense of everything in it. Structure, we just talked about that. Our theme needs to explain how all the pieces of the book fit together, all the passages. And then development, that refers to the movement, okay? And so as we read, we want to say, okay, what is going on? What's the main message of the book? What is the main message of this passage, right? Because you can read an individual passage and see kind of the main message. And then that really helps us when we identify that theme. So under this point, identifying a theme, I want to give you really three things to pay close attention to when you are trying to discover the theme. And the first thing to be on the lookout for is repetition. Repetition. So if you guys are taking notes in a class, one of the easiest ways to know what's important for a professor or what's important for you to know from the exam is what does the professor repeat? Okay? Anytime, think about it, anytime something is important to you, you're going to repeat it. You're going to tell the story a lot, right? My wife oftentimes will say, Jay, you've already told me that. Jay, you've already told me that. Why? Because if I get excited about something, I say it over and over again, I forget I said it, okay? The biblical authors, when they're wanting to drive home a point, will oftentimes repeat words, repeat phrases, and so forth and so on. A great example of this is in a movie. If any of you have seen the movie Braveheart, you know that in Braveheart, whenever he gets ready to ride into battle, there's one word that he constantly repeats to his soldiers throughout that movie, and it's the word freedom. So if you were to say the main message of Braveheart, freedom has to be in there somewhere. You have to have freedom as part of your message. Why? Because it's repeated at key scenes throughout the movie. Again, your first reading in the Bible is going to be in Genesis, right? In Genesis 2, the key words that we see repeat up time and time again throughout the book of Genesis is blessing and curse. Blessing and curse. So we have to ask, how are we blessing and curse? Why does he keep repeating those words? Why are those important? Genesis 1, you're about to read. There's a phrase in Genesis 1 that's repeated 7 times. Okay? So at that point, you should ask, why? What is being emphasized in Genesis? Well, what we'll talk about is how a lot of times Genesis 1 we start fighting over it, about creation versus evolution. And when we start fighting about it, we actually miss the main point. The main point, by repeating the phrase 7 times, is it was good, it was good, it was good, is to show that the God's original creation was good, right? That's what the author is trying to communicate. He doesn't have much use for our debates over creation versus evolution. He's trying to emphasize the goodness of creation. That debate wasn't even on his mind. And so forth and so on. So as we read, we want to focus on repetition. But as we're paying attention to repetition, what we also have to focus on is when there's a bunch of repetition and then there's a change. So to go back to Genesis 1, it says, it was good, it was good, it was good 7 times. And then we flip the page to Genesis 2, it says, it was not good. At which point, like red flags should start going off everywhere, and we should ask, something's not right. There's something here that draws our attention to that passage where there's a difference in the repetition. So repetition is monumental. It's one of the most important features of the Bible because especially in the Old Testament, they lived in a very oral culture. And in an oral culture, you repeat more than you do in a written culture. Just think of the difference in reading a book and listening to a sermon maybe. There's a lot more repetition in oral communication in order to help the readers catch the main point. So repetition. The second key thing to pay attention for as you're looking for the theme is cross-references. Now, what do I mean by cross-references? Well, if you have a Bible that has cross-references, you'll know what I'm talking about. There's like all these little verses listed in like the margin of your Bible, and it has little letters beside them that are basically attached to words in the biblical text. And all a cross-reference is it tells you where that word or that thing occurs in a different book. And so the point I want to make here is that the best commentary, the best explanation of the Bible is the Bible itself. So as you're reading, when you read, you want to, for instance, think about quotes of things that refer to earlier things you've read, okay? So when we get to Exodus, we're going to see this. When we get to Exodus 1, it tells us that the children of Israel, when they were in Egypt, they were fruitful and they multiplied and they spread across the land. Well, that is a direct allusion. The same words are used back in Genesis 2. They're used later with Noah in Genesis 9 when God tells them to be fruitful, to multiply, and fill the earth. So Moses in Exodus is wanting for us to remember what he wrote in Genesis 2 and Genesis 9 so that we interpret the later passage in light of the earlier passage. So you always interpret the Bible in light of what you have already read and what comes before. And we'll see that several times as we go through the Bible. Let me give you an example for this. For instance, later books in the Old Testament, and the prophets in particular, the prophets like Isaiah will oftentimes refer to Israel as Sodom and Gomorrah. Well, Sodom and Gomorrah is found in Genesis. And so what he is wanting to do is to remind the leaders of Israel that they are more corrupt than the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, which God destroyed by fire. Another good example is in Revelation chapter 4. Jesus is portrayed as a lamb who is slain. And where does that go back to? Well, that goes back to the imagery that we find in Exodus of the Passover lamb. So in other words, the last book of the Bible is pulling imagery all the way back from the early book in the Old Testament, and we're meant to understand that imagery as we draw that. And then one last example would be also in Revelation 4, where Jesus is referred to as the Lion of the tribe of Judah. Well, that phrase, Lion of the tribe of Judah, is an allusion back to Genesis 49. So the last book of the Bible is making a reference back to the first book of the Bible, and he's not explaining it. John's not explaining it. He expects us to understand the reference back to Genesis 49, where Jacob is blessing his sons, and he tells Judah that he will be like a lion. And so these connections are really important as you read the Bible because they help us better understand what is going on. And it shows us how later biblical writers oftentimes build on earlier books, and they assume our knowledge of those earlier books. So, as you're finding the theme, look for repetition, look for cross-references, and the last one is you want to look at the beginning and the end of books. I cannot emphasize this enough. The beginning and the end of books are so important. They're so critical to make sure you pay attention to how it began and then how it ended. For the sake of time, let me just use the ending as an example here. When we get to the book of Ruth, we're going to notice that the book of Ruth ends with a genealogy. And that seems pretty boring for us, right? But what's interesting about Ruth ending in a genealogy is that genealogy helps us actually understand the purpose of the whole book of Ruth, because it is showing why Ruth and Boaz meeting and having their baby why it was so important, because it connects it to a really important person who comes later in the biblical story. Another example would be the book of Kings. It ends with this, we'll talk about this story about King Jehoiakim, who's in exile and he's elevated in Babylon. And we have to ask the question, why does the book end by telling us that this king was eating with the king at the king of Babylon's table? And those raise important questions, and we'll talk about that as we get into the book of Kings. A good example of this with a movie would be the movie I Am Legend. If you've ever seen I Am Legend, and you buy the DVD, it actually has an alternate scene. And again, how a movie ends affects how you look back at everything that happened. And so if you watch I Am Legend and then you watch the alternate ending, you realize that the story, it does kind of, what we might say, color how you view the rest of the movie by watching that alternate ending. And so endings are exceedingly important. Okay? So crash course, I got 2 more things to say, but this is kind of in the process. The next 2 things I have to say kind of help us put a couple things together. But when we interpret the Bible, we want to read it well. We want to identify the genre, identify the structure, pay attention to the context, and then look for the theme. Find the theme or the themes. And how do we find the themes? Repetition, cross-references, and the beginning and the end of the books. Okay, 2 more notes, and then we will be finished. First thing, I want to say a word about commentaries. Okay, here's the deal. Many of you are not experts in the ancient Near East or in the Greco-Roman world. And one of the most important parts about interpreting the Bible is understanding the context in which the Bible is written. In other words, the Bible is written in a very agrarian society. There's a lot of customs and things, geographical features in the Bible that are just completely foreign to us. And so when it comes to that type of stuff, type of information, like that background information, that historical context, it is really important that you go to someone who does know something about those. And that's where commentaries come in. Commentaries are books that are written by scholars in which they just walk kind of verse by verse through whatever book it is that you're studying, and they explain what's going on and even explain some of the historical background. And so if you're wanting just a good one-stop Bible commentary, I would encourage you to purchase the New Bible Commentary. It's going to be intimidating because it's thick, but it has commentary on every book of the Bible. So if you're reading a passage and you're not understanding something, you can go back and look at the commentary and understand what's going on. But another value of commentaries is that you're getting someone else's interpretation. And it's really good that when you interpret the Bible, that you're always reading what others are saying about the passage or the book you're trying to interpret. Because, A, by reading someone else, we can oftentimes see blind spots in our own interpretation. But B, even if we disagree with the people we're reading, we're still getting a different perspective on the text, which either helps us further confirm our interpretation of the text, or it might cause us to tweak it some. So it's really good to read other people and what they're saying about the biblical text in order to better understand the text and get a deeper knowledge. And then finally, the last thing I want to talk about is, real quick, I want to discuss the distinction between what we say meaning and application is. So if you remember, I began this lecture by talking about what's the goal of the interpretive process. And I said the goal is that we find the author's intent. Well, the author's intent is what we call meaning. In other words, what the meaning has to do with the author and the original readers. So the author meant to communicate something to his original readers, and that is what we mean when we say meaning. Now, if you go to a lot of churches today and you go to like a class or a Bible study, you'll oftentimes have somebody sit around and they'll say, what does this passage mean to you? That's actually a terrible question. Because it really doesn't, the passage doesn't mean anything to you different than it meant to the original audience. And so if 5 people in the group say different things, that's nonsense, because the passage should have one major meaning, and that's the meaning the author intended to communicate. A better question is how would you apply this passage to your life? And that's where we're getting into application. So let me just kind of help you understand the difference between meaning and application. And if you learn nothing else from this, if you're ever leading a Bible study, never ask the question, what does this passage mean to you? What we should ask is, what does the passage mean? Okay, and then we should all agree on that, and then we can say, how might we apply it? Okay, so here we go. Meaning is related to the original author. Application is related to the reader. So when I'm after meaning, I'm saying, okay, what did the author communicate to his original readers? Good. When I'm applying it, I'm saying, how does that then transfer or apply to me and to my church or to this context that I currently live in? That's a big difference, right? So we want to understand the meaning first and then build the application off of that. 2, I just said this. Application must be based on the meaning of the text, okay? So, for instance, if I read a passage and I say, okay, this passage, the author intended to communicate that God is holy, right? So let's just take a Leviticus, a book all of you love. Okay, if we take Leviticus, Leviticus emphasizes God's holiness like no other book. But what did that look like to the readers of Leviticus? Well, for them it meant like they had all these like ceremonial laws, like foods that were clean, unclean. They couldn't touch dead bodies. They had all these procedures for if they got skin diseases. They had to be cleansed by the priest. It meant a lot of things that are absolutely foreign to us today. So we might ask the question, so if the meaning is God is holy, then we want to base our application on that. So the question might be, how does God's holiness impact me today? In other words, how might I apply God's holiness to my life? And what that should look like for us means is that as His people, we should be set apart from the culture around us. That means we should look different from the world. We should look different from how everyone else acts and lives and speaks and the things they do. And so the holiness question does help us apply it. God is holy. That's the meaning of the passage. How does that apply to me? Well, it means I should be set apart from my culture. And in this culture, that looks a lot different than it did in Israel's culture, right? And so, but that's the why your meaning must be based on the application. In fact, what I like to tell people is you should take your major theme and then use that as a bridge to your application, okay? And then the last and the third point is this. Application involves moving from one context to a new context. And that's why some people refer to application as recontextualization. So we recontextualize the meaning of the passage. So that's what I just did. The theme was God is holy. In Leviticus, the context is Israel by the tabernacle in the wilderness. It talks about sacrifices and all that. If we transfer it over to our context, the holiness means that we should be set apart as the people of God. I've recontextualized it. And our context is much different than the context of Israel in the wilderness. And so understanding it that way helps us better understand it. So, when you're in your next Bible study, instead of asking, what does this passage mean to you? You should ask, how would you apply this passage to your life? That's a much better question. All right?